Welcome to this episode of Policy RX with the Rock Doc. I'm Eric Murdoch coming to you from the doctor's office in Estes Park, Colorado. So for this episode, we have Tommy Caldwell on board. Tommy, of course, is one of the greatest climbers on Earth. He starred in the Dawn Wall, an award-winning movie, as well as the author of The Push. Now Tommy works as the global sports ambassador for Patagonia, and he's got a lot of other things going on. Tommy, thank you so much for taking a break from sending the NAR to be with us at Policy RX today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Eric. Good to chat with you this morning.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So today we're going to talk about something that's really relevant at Policy RX. We're always trying to have interviews with people who know about issues that are happening today. The current issue that's really coming to a head is the land transfer at Oak Flat, Arizona. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on at Oak Flat, and then we'll talk a little bit about Bears Ears. Both of these issues seem to be part of Tommy's portfolio at Patagonia. He's become quite a great spokesperson for climbing in Washington, D.C., and he's got pretty sophisticated ideas and understanding of these issues. So we're really appreciative, Tommy, for your participation at Policy RX today. So let's get into it. So what's your experience at Oak Flat? I mean, I think I might have crossed paths with you 30 years ago at the Phoenix Bouldering Contest.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll back up just a little bit, even farther. So really, everybody just knows me as a rock climber. I've been a professional rock climber for like 30 years now. But I got into trying to help protect these climbing areas and places that we climb through the Access Fund. I was a board member, like in the early 2000s. And then I started doing lobby work for the Climb the Hill event. And because of that, Patagonia gave me this job. I went from being just an ambassador to being a global sports activist. So that's really kind of like kept my motivation high and kept me really focused on issues like Oak Flat. Now, I went to the Phoenix Bouldering Contest, which was at Oak Flat, from the age of like 16, when I was 16 years old, for the next 7 years straight. So that was probably most of the years that the Phoenix Bouldering Contest existed. It was the biggest, I think it was the biggest gathering of climbers, period, at the time in the world. It was there's like several thousand people that would all kind of come together at the Oak Flat campground and have this giant bouldering contest. It was super fun. They would everybody would camp out in the Oak Flat campground, and they would start every morning with like a Jimi Hendrix rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. And it was really like this cultural moment, this like 90s cultural moment of climbing. And because of that, it was one of the kind of most revered bouldering areas in the U.S. at that time. Like, people thought of Waco tanks, of course, in that part of the country, but they also thought of Oak Flat.
Yeah, I was there also. I remember that rude awakening with Jimi Hendrix blasted over the loudspeaker. That was a great start to the contest when it was at Oak Flat. Yeah. So you were climbing there back in the 90s, and then when did you first find out about this idea that Oak Flat would be transferred to a foreign mining company, handing over $1 billion of America's copper, just handing it over to a foreign mining company, and then, as an aside, we're also damaging sacred sites and perhaps resulting in the largest loss of climbing in the history of the United States?
Yeah, I can't remember when I think the Phoenix Bouldering Contest was actually canceled because we thought we had already lost the fight. So do you remember what year that was when they were trying to do this? They were trying to convince, they were like flying some professional climbers, not me, but some other climbers around in helicopters, trying to find a quote replacement area for Oak Flat.
I think in the early 2000s, there were some bills that were introduced to transfer the land from the Forest Service, public land, to Resolution Copper. And those bills were introduced for a decade. And I think it really speaks volumes that those bills never passed. The American public, our representatives in Congress, they didn't want that to happen. And you're right that throughout the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about the potential for transferring that land, but they couldn't get the bills passed because it was just an unpopular bill. And then in 2014, some senators jammed the land transfer into the National Defense Authorization Act. So the 2015 National Defense Authorization Act included a law that said that once an environmental impact statement was completed, the American government, the federal government would have to transfer that land to Resolution Copper. So that I think that's the history on sort of how this played out. But you're right that we've known about this for, I mean, well over 20 years.
Yeah, and I feel like in the beginning of the fight, the climbers were actually a pretty major force. Like I was
Yeah.
surprised that the mining company was willing to fly, climbers around in helicopters and like purchase this replacement area. Like my impression was the Access Fund specifically it was like a huge player against this, you know, giant, super wealthy, multi-billion, trillion-dollar, you know, mining conglomerates. Like I was like, wow, they actually pay attention to the climbers, which was pretty interesting. I wasn't that involved back then. I got more involved probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago when the school teacher Cooper Davis, he called me up and he's like, I am taking up this Oak Flat fight with a bunch of my students who are, some of them are San Carlos Apache tribal members. And he's like, will you come down to this prayer run that we're doing? And so that got me back involved. And that was around the same time when I was starting to do more kind of political advocacy for the Access Fund. Also at that time, Wensler Noisy, this San Carlos Apache member set up a teepee and started living at the campground. And I would say the tribe became sort of the major fight against the mining company, and that's when I really got involved. That's when I started to go to DC. I went down to Arizona and did a whole series of events and tried to get the climbing community re-engaged. And that's when I really started to learn the details of the mine. Like in my mind, we need copper. Obviously, this is one of the biggest known copper deposits. I mean, certainly in North America, maybe in the world, and we need that. But and I wanted to protect the climbing, but when you really get into the details of it, just the fact that the way that the mining law and mines are set up is really makes it make no sense at all. Like, the whole fact that it's sacred land for the San Carlos Apache tribe is super powerful. But also, most Americans don't even know that this is a foreign mining conglomerate, not even owned by America, that are going to come in and mine this copper. They're going to send it overseas. They're going to destroy the land. And the American taxpayers are probably going to be left with a Superfund site. So they're not even going to reap the benefits financially of the copper. And they're probably going to have to pay a lot for it. And then there's issues with the water. It's going to take tons of Colorado River water, which we know there's not enough of that already. And that's when I started to be like, this just doesn't make sense. Like, we got to fight hard because there's so many reasons that this mine specifically and a lot of mines just don't even make sense at all.
Yeah, those are some really good points. And, this area has been mined for, a century. But I agree with you that this particular mining plan of the foreign mining company would actually use block cave mining techniques, which would subside the entire area into a crater. This is not like just tunneling underground and getting some copper. This is destroying the landscape, and I think that that's really important for us all to know because as a byproduct, the San Carlos Apache lose sacred sites, climbers lose climbing areas, the ecosystem is damaged, and the copper goes away, and the American public doesn't benefit from it. So it's a very weird project, and I agree with you. It's important to sort of publicize to the climbing community what this is all about. It's not a partisan issue, regardless of what party you're affiliated with. It's a pretty powerful project in terms of damaging our public lands and reducing our access. So I'm really appreciative that you're involved. What are your plans? Like, how are you working with the Apache Stronghold or this group that you're advocating with? What are your plans now for what you're going to do?
I mean, it's really kind of a moving target. For a long time, we were trying to get the Save Oak Flat Act passed, or this, then it was reintroduced as the Save Oak Flat from foreign mining, really get legislation passed. In the current administration, it's shifted to a religious freedoms case. It seems like in the current political landscape, that's sort of the most likely, in my mind, winning strategy. These big like land protection fights just take a lot of creativity. There's a lot of moving parts, and so the important thing is that you just have to be kind of pursuing all avenues and delaying it as long as possible. I think the thing I'm learning about these big environmental fights is you never actually win them because they can always come back and change the laws and extract from the land and destroy the land. So you just keep fighting as long as you possibly can. So right now, I think the religious freedoms case is probably the most likely. Just last week, they got a local Supreme Court to hear the case, which is likely to push it up to the actually, to the higher Supreme Court in the nation, which is a big win. I actually went with the San Carlos Apache tribe to the steps of the Supreme Court in D.C. last year when they introduced the case. Like, they brought the paperwork to the case, and there was a big protest on the steps, and it seemed unlikely that they were going to hear the case, but it's seeming more and more likely all the time.
Yeah, we're rooting for the San Carlos Apache. And if the Supreme Court hears this case, that is a big, it's a big move in protecting Oak Flat. So we're all hopeful on that. Actually, Access Fund filed a lawsuit in 2021 on the environmental impact statement, calling out the deficiencies in the statement. In the environmental impact statement itself, it didn't really deal with water and some of the tailings piles and a variety of other kind of logistical issues associated with the mining. So I think the combination of the two pressures hopefully will make some progress. I want to switch over to Bears Ears because it's interesting. Right now, we're hearing murmurs that Bears Ears National Monument is at risk, and we just talked about Oak Flat. That's a big project for you, but Bears Ears has been a big project for you also. Can you talk a little bit about your history with Bears Ears and why it's so important to have that monument?
Yeah, I mean, so Bears Ears is obviously where Indian Creek is. Indian Creek sits in the middle of Bears Ears. It's way more vast than that. I started going there with my dad to Indian Creek Canyon when I was like 5 years old, when there was barely any climbers there. Like, we'd go down there for the Thanksgiving holiday, and there'd be like 3 cars of climbers. Obviously, it's now known, rightly so, as probably the best crack climbing in the world. In Indian Creek. But in more recent years, when I started to get involved in this like monument designation, I was like kind of loosely involved in the original Obama monument designation. I started going down there and exploring sort of the greater Bears Ears region and understanding more about the climbing. And then, I really believe that if I'm gonna work to protect these lands, I need to understand the viewpoint of like the indigenous people. And Bears Ears was, that county, that region was one of the most populous places in the whole United States, hundreds of years ago. And so there's like a vast amount of archaeological, besides the climbing, there's a vast amount of archaeological like history down there. I think so many Americans just think of the history of the US starting with like, Columbus. When you go to Bears Ears, you're like, oh, and you're like, why is there nothing old in the US? You go to Europe and you're like, oh, all the buildings are so old. You go to Bears Ears and you're like, oh, there's a history here that it dates back so far, and it's very cool, and it's certainly worth protecting.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that story of you going down and sort of meeting with some of the intertribal coalition elders. Maybe they were from the Navajo Nation. I don't know the details of your story, but could you speak a little bit to that trip where you sort of were learning from the intertribal coalition elders and spending time to understand a little bit more about the history of Bears Ears?
Yeah, so the climbers and the business community and the tribes were really working closely together, I would say 10 years ago, for the original Obama monument. But then at some point, it's sort of like the relationship sort of got a little bit more loose for whatever reason. I think the tribal members that are involved kind of switched over, and people thought that the Obama monument was safe. So when Trump tried to roll it back, I decided to get involved, and so I ended up connecting with this group of totally badass land protectors called the Women of Bears Ears, and went down and like attended a prayer ceremony in Bears Ears with them, and it was incredibly moving. Like, I think I went to Bears Ears being like, oh, this is a place that's owned by the American people. Climbers are some of the people that use it the most. And so we have this connection with the land. But going there with the women of Bears Ears, I was like, oh, my connection with this land as a climber is nothing compared to these women. Like their cultural and archaeological and spiritual heritage is all tied up in this. They think of the land and the rocks as like their ancestors. I was like, we are just a supporting role. These are the people that really should be making the choices about how this land is managed, and they want the monument. And I would say that that sort of intensified my motivation and helped clarify sort of the fight and how to protect it. Yes, I'm like looking after it for the climbers, because I think that the monument is the best way to kind of secure climbing. But also, this land was taken by Westerners from these tribal members that are still there. Like when I was a kid, I would see the petroglyphs, I would see the ruins and the cliffs, and I thought that those people were gone, but they're not. They're still there.
Yeah, you've done really incredible work with tribal members down there, and you've definitely helped me sort of understand that perspective. I also remember a famous photo of you taking a massive whip off a finger crack when you were sort of a kid, and that's sort of an inspirational image for climbers. What was that
Yeah,
photo? Could you speak to
yeah,
that?
yeah. When I was, I grew up trad climbing with my dad, and then I just turned into a total sport climber for a lot of years. But then at one point, I was like, I want to free climb El Cap, and I was like, I need to learn how to use cams better. I need to get into trad climbing. So I did a trip to Indian Creek, and I had been doing tons of climbing in rifle, and sort of the way that we would climb the routes in rifle is we would just clip the bare minimum number of bolts and end up taking these massive whippers. And at that time, Indian Creek was mostly full of like real trad daddy climbers, and their ethic was they kind of were like put a cam in every body length. And so I went to Indian Creek as a teenager who was a 514 climber, and I was like, I just get too pumped to stop and place gear, so I'm just gonna find good gear and then just run it out. And I ended up going down there with this famous climber named Craig Lubin, this great photographer back in the day, the guy that invented Big Bros. And I tried this route called Broken Brain, and it ended up taking like this 40-foot whipper. I put in these cams and just tried to gun it for the top and blew it right at the top and took this huge fall. And it became kind of a famous picture because people just didn't do that in Indian Creek. You only took little falls, and here I was taking this massive fall, and it got captured in a photo, and that photo is kind of famous now.
I love the way your tenacity on the rock is the same as your tenacity um, in protecting these areas. It seems like you're approaching these things with the same sort of attitude, and that's clear and really appreciated by the conservation and recreation communities.
And then I'll just add in just last year, as we were trying to build the recreation plan for Bears Ears, I went back down there and met with a bunch of the tribal elders and the Bears Ears Coalition, which is kind of the major advocate, indigenous led advocacy force down there nowadays, and really tried to understand what build this bond between the climbing community, make it so that we could support the tribal members and establish a recreation plan that would work for all of us. And the Access Funds, I was there with the Access Fund, and we met with the Forest Service people and the tribal members and had this really powerful, amazing trip. I actually took tribal elders climbing. It was kind of trippy to go to Indian Creek and get like these elderly tribal people like up a pitch in Indian Creek. Yeah, it was a pretty fun
What did
trip.
they think of the climbing?
They understood the playful nature of climbing, like hanging out with these tribal members. They're so like they laugh all the time. They're constantly giving each other grief in this sort of good-hearted way, and so they really understand playing really well. And so climbing brought that. Like we had a super fun time. They did question climbing, though. I would say we went to the Battle of the Bulge Buttress, which is one of the more highly impacted climbing areas down there. There's routes where the desert varnish has been basically worn off by climbers, like dragging their hips up the wall, dragging cams up the wall. There's a few routes with big chain anchors. And when you take tribal members climbing, they look up at these chain anchors and they see that we've drilled them into the wall. And to them, it's like a physical wound. So they are so open to compromising. And as long as we're kind of fighting the bigger fight together, I think they support the climbers. But it does give me pause a little bit. It is like it makes me think about the kind of impact that we're causing and want to find ways to make sure that we're minimizing that.
Yeah, yeah, good points. And I bet that a lot of those folks really connect with you because such an optimistic and happy person. You're also smiling and laughing a lot, and that's a real cool attribute of you. Well, let's wrap this up, and can you tell us if you've got any projects or trips or plans in the near future going on?
I mean, yeah, I've always got stuff going on. Rock climbing wise, I just got back from an incredible trip to Cochimo, which is, a big land protections fight in Chile, which was a super fun trip. And it sort of spurred a fascination with that region and a bit of an understanding about all the environmental issues going on in the Chilean coast. And so I am in the process of trying to put together a human powered trip that would go from the very southern tip of South America all the way up, kind of the Patagonia region of Chile. And it would involve climbing and skiing across the biggest ice cap outside of the Arctic and kayaking in the oceans and all sorts of stuff. Right now the idea is too big. I got to figure out a way to scale it back, but it's sort of mostly about adventure stoke and huge, just a giant adventure, but also trying to, make people aware of how special that place is and how kind of impacted it is by the extractive industry. So that's kind of the sweet spot for me these days, is finding sort of the collision of those two worlds. I'm also still racing Sonny Trotter and Alex Honnold back to the ninth grade, to 9A. As middle-aged dads, we kind of made this pact to all try and climb 9A again. Sonny won. He already did it. But I'm still trying to do it. And actually, I almost sent my project yesterday or 2 days ago. So I'm going, I'm here in Tahoe, living in South Lake Tahoe these days. I'm doing a lot of cragging and just trying to stay strong.
Sounds good. Yeah, I hope you send your 9A. And if you need help supporting your expedition, you always got my number. So, thank you so much for joining us on Policy RX. Climbers, stay tuned for our next episode. We'll be talking about a relevant issue dealing with public lands, climbing, and other things that relate to our community. So thanks, Tommy, and we'll see everyone else in a couple weeks.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Really good to chat this morning, and keep up the good work. You're killing it these days. So impressed.
Thanks, buddy.